It is just past midnight on December 17th, 1944, and the frozen forests of Belgium are a black, brutal wilderness. Snow is falling hard, thick flakes swirling like smoke, burying the narrow roads of the Ardennes under dense sheets of white. A single military truck growls through the storm, its engine straining against the invisible resistance of the ice and snow with every difficult mile. Inside the canvas-covered cab, the driver grips the steering wheel so tight his knuckles have turned bone white. His windshield wipers thump a desperate, rhythmic beat, struggling in vain to keep up with the blizzard. He knows he is lost. Somewhere behind him, or perhaps dangerously ahead, is the fluid, terrifying, and chaotic front line of the Battle of the Bulge. His map is useless now, ripped at the edges, soaked with sweat, smeared with dirt. Road signs are either gone, buried by the snow, or twisted and rerouted by enemy commandos disguised as Americans. Radio silence has been ordered. His unit does not know where he is, and he has no idea where the American line truly begins or where the German spearhead has broken through. But in the back of his truck, beneath a thin canvas tarp, is a payload more precious than gold. Thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel, gasoline meant for American Sherman tanks, supply trucks, and artillery batteries waiting at the very edge of collapse. Fuel for men who are cold, cornered, and nearly out of options. What this driver does not know is this. If he turns back now, if he runs out of fuel himself, or if he is captured, then the last desperate push of Hitler's elite panzer units may break through the Allied front line, seize the key supply depots, and potentially change the course of the war in Europe. History, in this lonely cab, rests on a single, vital delivery. But somehow, against all odds and all logic, this wrong turn, this one man's accidental mistake, will become the turning point in one of the most brutal battles of World War II. What he delivers will not just restart dead engines, it will reignite hope. This is the forgotten story of a man who was never meant to be a hero, a truck driver named Jack Miller, who went the wrong way and brought the right thing to the right place at the exact right time. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes, a forested stretch of hills and icy ravines along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, was chosen precisely because it was considered quiet, too dense for a massive tank campaign. The Allies had thinned their lines here, believing the region to be safe. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of thick darkness and relentless snow, over 200,000 German troops surged through the trees, backed by more than 1,000 tanks. Their goal was audacious: punch a hole in the American line, rush to the Belgian port of Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in two, hoping to force a favorable peace deal on the Western Front. The sheer speed of the attack was terrifying. German armored columns, moving with desperate momentum, had enough gasoline for just a few days of rapid advance. Their entire strategy relied on seizing Allied fuel depots along the way. If they moved too slowly or ran out of fuel, they would be stranded. On the American side, panic rippled through the front. Entire regiments were caught flat-footed. Roads, already narrow and frozen, clogged with retreating civilians and desperate convoys. But in the chaos, another, more profound problem emerged. The Allies themselves were critically low on fuel. The rapid push through France weeks earlier had stretched supply lines perilously thin. Storage depots were scattered and vulnerable. The fuel delivery system, the absolute lifeblood of every modern army, was collapsing. Without gasoline, the most powerful army in the world could be stopped cold. When German forces began targeting Allied fuel depots, capturing or destroying them, panic turned into paralysis. Entire battalions of tanks were stranded, their guns silent, their steel bodies turning into coffins because the trucks carrying their gasoline never arrived. This is where Jack Miller enters the story. Far from the front lines, a man in a canvas-covered truck carrying nothing but fuel and hope through a storm, confusion, and roads no one else dared to drive. Jack was 31 years old, a truck driver from Pennsylvania who worked at a gas station before the war. He knew the sound of an engine better than most men knew the sound of their own heartbeat. That skill earned him a spot in the Motor Transport Corps, the unsung, essential backbone of the Allied advance. For months he had been driving non-stop, hauling barrels of fuel over bombed-out bridges and through shattered villages. He understood his mission implicitly. Fuel was life. Every drop that reached the front meant another tank that could move, another gun that could fire, another life that might be saved. When Jack received the order that cold December morning to deliver a full load of high-octane gasoline to an armored division near the town of Stavelot, he didn't hesitate. He checked his tires, cleaned his windshield, and turned the key, listening as the engine rumbled awake. The route was supposed to be simple: 3 hours, 2 checkpoints, 1 delivery. But the German offensive had already thrown the entire region into chaos. Road signs were missing, or deliberately switched by German commandos dressed in American uniforms. Supply maps were obsolete. Jack didn't know it yet, but the town he was supposed to reach was already under attack. He drove past other convoys, some burned out, others abandoned. The familiar hum of his tires was broken only by the distant, low, dull thunder of artillery. Every few miles he stopped to check his bearings, but the landmarks were gone: shattered trees, burned houses. The road signs that should have pointed him toward Stavelot now pointed toward nowhere at all. Still, Jack pressed on, because somewhere out there, men were waiting. At one point, the road felt suddenly wrong. The trees leaned in too close, the turns were too sharp. Worst of all, he hadn't seen another vehicle for 20 minutes. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling like a wall of smoke. He slowed the truck, his hands tight on the wheel. He looked at the fuel gauge, still nearly full, but running out of fuel out here, alone in the snow, was a death sentence. He pulled over, climbed down into the biting cold, and unrolled his canvas map. He traced his finger over the lines, trying to match them to the terrain, but the terrifying truth hit him. The road he was on was not on the map. He was lost, and worse, he was likely deep inside enemy territory. He stood staring at the empty, snow-covered dirt. He looked back at the fuel tank. Thousands of gallons of the exact thing the Germans were running out of sat just behind that thin steel wall. If a single scout patrol stumbled onto this lonely truck, he wouldn't be taken prisoner. He would be turned into fire. He climbed back into the cab, slammed the door, and the engine sputtered, then roared back to life. That sound gave him a sliver of courage. He had a decision to make: sit still and hope for rescue, turn around and risk a compromised road, or push forward alone into the unknown. Tapping the dashboard, he whispered, "Come on, girl, we're not done yet." He rolled forward slowly, having switched off his headlights, driving by feel, scanning for shadows that didn't belong. The silence of the deep forest was absolute, the kind that made his own breathing sound too loud, the kind that made him feel watched. Then, far ahead, he saw a tiny flicker of light. He killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in. Could it be a German campfire? A lost American patrol? Jack pulled out his sidearm, a standard-issue Colt pistol he had never fired in combat. He waited, fingers numb around the grip. Nothing. The light vanished. He started the engine again and rolled slowly toward a junction, a fork where the road split into 3 narrow, unmarked paths. He stopped, stepped outside, and the snow crunched softly under his boots. He scanned the area with his red-lensed flashlight. Then he saw it. On the trunk of a tree, barely visible beneath the frost, was a faint stencil, an American star. It was faded, old, but real. Someone American had passed through here. It meant something. He made his choice: the middle road. Back in the truck, he turned onto the center path, heart pounding. It was then he noticed something else, a faint smell of burnt oil and exhaust. Somewhere up ahead, something had been here recently, or was still here. He followed the scent. He passed abandoned vehicles, one flipped over in a ditch, its wheels spinning. Another riddled with bullet holes, but no bodies. Somehow worse. The trees began to thin. And then, after what felt like hours but had been less than 30 minutes, he saw it. barbed wire, stacked sandbags, a low trench half buried in snow. He eased to a stop. From the shadows, a voice called out, "Halt! Password!" Jack's hands shot into the air, his breath catching in his throat. He shouted back, clear and slow, "Philadelphia!" A pause. Then, the order, "Advance and be recognized." Jack rolled forward slowly, hands still raised. A face emerged from the trench, an American helmet, an M1 rifle. Relief nearly made him collapse. The soldier waved him in. "You're late," the man muttered. "We were about to give up on your convoy." Jack shook his head. "I'm not a convoy. I'm—" The man stared at the fuel drums in the back of the truck. "Is that what I think it is?" Jack nodded. "High-octane for the armor division. I got lost." The soldier whistled low. "You have no idea what you just did." Jack didn't have to wait long to find out. As soon as his truck rolled into the makeshift American position, soldiers began pulling off the fuel drums. Men with frostbitten cheeks and tired eyes worked without speaking. This was the final outpost holding the line before the town of Trois-Ponts, a critical junction of roads and bridges. If this position fell, the door would be wide open for German tanks to sweep deeper into Allied territory. For 2 days, the Shermans here had been dead in the snow, their crews sleeping beside them, waiting for either fuel or orders to retreat. Neither had come until now. Jack watched as fuel lines were run, pumps connected, and engines that had been silent for 36 hours coughed back to life. One by one, the Shermans came alive. The rumble of their diesel engines broke the silence like thunder. Smoke belched from exhaust pipes. Turrets swiveled. A young lieutenant approached Jack, shaking his hand. "You came alone?" Jack nodded. The officer looked back at the tanks rolling forward into position. "That's impossible," he said. But it was not. It was just in time. Within the hour, German armored units from Kampfgruppe Piper, one of the most brutal and determined spearheads of Hitler's army, were spotted moving toward the position. They had already taken Stavelot. They were desperate for fuel, desperate to break through, and they had no idea the Americans had just been refueled. The Shermans rolled out of the tree line, engines howling, tracks crushing frozen mud, and set up ambush points. When the Germans came, expecting silence and surrender, they were met with a wall of fire. Shells burst from tank barrels. Machine guns roared. The enemy, stunned by the sudden, intense American resistance, fell back in confusion. The fuel Jack had delivered gave those men mobility. It gave them defense. It gave them life. And critically, it denied the Germans the one thing they needed most: Allied fuel depots. Hitler's entire gamble in the Ardennes depended entirely on momentum and stolen fuel. Without that fuel, Kampfgruppe Piper stalled. Historians now agree that engagement, small as it was, helped prevent the German spearhead from reaching the major fuel depot at Spa and Trois-Ponts. Their advance ground to a halt in the snow. Crews abandoned their vehicles. Piper himself escaped on foot with just a handful of men. The dream of splitting the Allied forces was over. Jack Miller never fired a weapon. He never gave an order. He never even left the supply route, at least not on purpose. But the fuel he delivered at the right moment, in the right place, turned the tide of a critical corner of the battle. He spent the night at the outpost, sleeping in the cab of his truck. When he woke up the next morning, an officer shook his hand and told him something he would never forget. "You saved a battalion. You just don't know it yet." Jack never talked much about that day. After the war, he returned to Pennsylvania, married, had 2 sons, and drove trucks again, this time with no snow, no gunfire, no risk of ambush. He never asked for medals. He never claimed to be a hero. He just kept driving. That was his mission. For decades, he never spoke of what happened that winter. To him, it had just been a bad drive in a snowstorm, and he'd kept going. That was enough. Years later, when his grandson asked him about the war for a school project, Jack finally told the story. The fuel, the wrong turn, the standoff at the trench. The boy, wide-eyed, asked him, "Did you know you were saving people?" Jack just smiled and said, "I just knew they were waiting." That is a truth that matters, Because war is not only won by generals and brilliant maneuvers. Sometimes it is won by people who show up, who keep their word, who drive when the road is gone, and who deliver something important when it matters most. The forgotten soldiers are not truly forgotten. Not if we remember what they stood for, what they carried, and what they refused to let go of. Jack Miller was not a hero because he got it right. He was a hero because even when he got it wrong, he kept going. That is what makes his story timeless. It is the paradox of courage. Sometimes the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take. And sometimes it takes a wrong turn to find your way into history.